I walked into my own studio at 6 in the morning, the day of the biggest meeting of my life, and found every gown I'd spent 11 months building for it in pieces on the floor. Not stolen, not damaged by accident. Cut. Deliberately, methodically cut, the way you'd cut something you wanted to make sure could never be repaired. 6 wedding dresses. My entire collection for the boutique buyer who was flying in from Chicago that afternoon to decide whether my designs would finally get picked up by a real retail chain. Beadwork I'd sewn by hand over hundreds of hours. Silk I'd saved for 2 years to afford. All of it in ribbons across my cutting table. My husband, Marcus, was sitting at the kitchen counter when I came upstairs, still shaking, drinking his coffee like it was any other Tuesday.
"You work too much,"
he said, not looking up from his phone.
"Maybe now you'll finally slow down."
I stood in the doorway of the home I'd shared with this man for 6 years, looking at hands that had once promised to support everything I loved. And I understood, for the first time, that he hadn't been careless. He'd been patient. He'd been waiting for exactly the morning that would hurt the most. But he had no idea what would happen next. My name is Isabella. I'm 32, and for most of my adult life, sewing has been the one thing that made me feel like myself. I learned on my grandmother's machine when I was 9, in a tiny apartment in Providence, and by the time I was in college, I was already altering bridesmaid dresses for extra money between classes. There's something about a wedding gown specifically that I've never been able to explain to people who don't do this work. You're not just making fabric fit a body. You're making something for the single day someone has been imagining, in some form, since they were a child. People trust you with that. It's a strange, quiet honor, and I never stopped taking it seriously. I met Marcus at a friend's engagement party 7 years ago. He was charming in the particular way that confident men in finance often are. He had opinions about everything, and delivered them like facts. And in the beginning, I mistook that certainty for strength. My own father had left when I was 12, and my mother worked 2 jobs to keep us steady. So I grew up associating a man who had things handled with safety. Marcus had things handled. He paid for our first apartment almost entirely on his own during the 2 years I was building my client list from nothing. He co-signed the small business loan that let me rent my first real studio space instead of working out of our spare bedroom. I want to be honest about something here, because I don't think this story is fair to tell any other way. I loved him, genuinely, for a long time. And some of that love was real gratitude for things he actually did for me early on. I also have my own flaws. I disappear into my work for days at a time. I forget to eat. I've let arguments go unresolved because I convinced myself that being tired from sewing all day meant I didn't have the energy left to fight for myself in my own marriage. Marcus thought my exhaustion, but he learned, over time, exactly how to use it. The small things started around year 3. He began describing my business, in front of other people, as my little project. Not cruelly, always with a smile, always framed as something endearing. At his company holiday party, when a colleague's wife asked what I did, Marcus answered for me.
"She sews dresses. It keeps her busy."
I stood there, holding a glass of wine, feeling something in my chest fold in on itself, and words that, because saying something in that room, felt like making a scene out of a joke that wasn't worth reading our corpse. Then it was the money. Even after my business loan was fully paid off, Even after I started turning a real profit 2 years in, Marcus kept your waking with the books, insisting it made more sense for someone who understood spreadsheets. I letting him, partly out of trust, partly because arguing about who managed a Google spreadsheet felt too small a hill to die on. I thinking, aware at the time, how much access that gave him to every account tied to the books. Then he's terms the corporate projects, suggesting I draft time-consuming custom orders in favor of serving alterations that paying faster, even though the custom gowns were the entire reason I'd started this business in the words of place. When your podcasts, he'd sigh and say something like, "You're just trying together about this," and me feel unreasonable for counting to keep doing the toxic of the waking core then it weist your taking of a small observing. He'd text asking when I'd be home, then comfort quiet and shortful with me when of interesting around closing off with this fixing than a needing the comfort taking worth home instead, sewing at the kitchen table at midnight, after he'd gone to bed, so the hours wouldn't become another argument. Then it was my space itself. He started calling the studio your hobby room, instead of my business, even in conversations with my own clients on the rare occasions he answered my phone for me. He suggested, more than once, that I move my equipment into a smaller rented unit across town, one with worse light and a longer commute, because the space I was in was expensive for something that doesn't even pay for itself yet. Even though, by then, it did. Then it was my name, in the most literal sense. When Renata and I finally incorporated the business properly in our 5th year, Marcus insisted, gently but firmly, that it made more sense financially for the business's primary banking contact to be him, since he already understood the accounts. I remember signing the paperwork at our kitchen table, half distracted by a client fitting scheduled for that same afternoon, not fully registering what I was authorizing. It felt, at the time, like one more small administrative task in a marriage full of them. He also began quietly discouraging me from spending time with my mother, the same way he discouraged the late nights. Not with a direct request, but with a particular kind of weary sigh whenever I mentioned visiting her. A comment about how every visit turns into you coming home stressed about money, which wasn't even true, but which I stopped correcting, because correcting it always turned into a longer conversation than I had energy for. My visits went from every other week to once a month, then to holidays only, without either of us ever agreeing to that change out loud. None of these, on their own, felt like the kind of thing you leave a marriage over. That was exactly the problem. By the time I noticed how small my business had become inside my own home, how much of it I was already apologizing for before anyone had even criticized it, the shrinking had been happening for years, one manageable inch at a time. The morning I found my collection destroyed wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first time what had been happening to my dream became something I could actually see. I didn't scream at him that morning. I couldn't. I was too stunned to do anything but call my business partner, Renata, and cancel the buyer's flight with a lie about a studio flood. I spent the day quietly picking through fabric scraps, trying to determine what, if anything, could be salvaged, while Marcus went to work like it was any other Tuesday. That night, once he was asleep, I sat down with the studio's business laptop, something I almost never used since he handled the numbers. I don't fully know what made me open the accounting software instead of just going to bed. Maybe some instinct that had been building in me for longer than I'd admitted. What I found took my breath away in a completely different direction than the ruined dresses had. There were 2 loans I didn't recognize,
both taken out against the business's line of credit over the past year, totaling nearly $40,000. Both had my digital signature on them. Both had been used, according to the transaction history, to pay down a separate account, one in Marcus's name at a bank I'd never heard of. I spent the next hour clicking through statement after statement with my hands shaking. The withdrawals lined up almost exactly with months I remembered him coming home tense and distracted, claiming work stress. They lined up with a networking trip to Atlantic City he'd taken alone 8 months earlier. They lined up with a car he'd bought as an investment that he swore had come from a work bonus. I found one more document that night, buried in a subfolder labeled simply MISC, that made the rest of it click into place. It was a letter from a debt collection agency addressed to Marcus directly, referencing an outstanding balance connected to an online sportsbook account. The letter was dated over a year earlier. He had known about this debt long before any of the loans against my business existed. He hadn't stumbled into using my business to cover a sudden emergency. He had made a decision, at some specific point I could now trace almost to the week, to solve his problem using the one thing in our marriage that was entirely mine. My husband hadn't just been quietly shrinking my dream down to something manageable for himself. He had been draining it, slowly and deliberately, to cover gambling debts I never knew existed, using a business that carried my name and represented everything I had spent a decade building. I didn't confront him that week. Something in me went very still and very quiet, the way I imagine you go still right before you understand you're not just hurt. You're also in danger of losing everything you've built if you handle this wrong. I called Renata first, not to vent, but to ask her, carefully,
whether she'd noticed anything odd in our books over the past year. She admitted she'd wondered about a few things, but assumed I'd approved them, since Marcus always signed off using an email address that looked official enough. I opened a separate email account Marcus didn't know existed, and began forwarding myself copies of every statement, every loan document, every login timestamp I could find, dating each discovery the way I'd once dated pattern pieces in my sketchbook. I contacted the bank listed on the mystery account and, giving my legal name and identification, asked whether any accounts existed under my name or my business's tax ID that I hadn't personally opened. The representative couldn't share details immediately, but confirmed enough. Yes, there were accounts. Yes, I should come in with ID, to tell me I wasn't imagining this. I met with a lawyer, a friend of Renata's, on my lunch break, sitting in her office with the loan documents spread across her desk like fabric I was trying to piece into a pattern I didn't want to see the shape of. She told me, gently, that this went beyond marital disagreement. The signatures alone, if forged, moved this into fraud. During that same month, I also started rebuilding, quietly, in whatever hours I could find. Renata and I met at her apartment instead of the studio, sketching replacement designs on her dining table late into the night, using scraps of fabric she'd been saving from her own projects. It felt strange, doing that work in secret, the way I imagine it feels to plant something you're not sure will survive the season. I didn't tell her everything yet. Not the loans, not the lawsuit search that hadn't started. I just told her I needed 6 new dresses and didn't want to explain why right away. She didn't push. She just started cutting patterns with me. I also began paying closer attention to things I'd stopped noticing entirely. How Marcus's phone stayed face down on every surface now. How he'd started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. How a credit card statement I glimpsed once briefly before he folded it away, had a balance that didn't match anything either of us had discussed spending. None of it was proof by itself. Together, it was becoming a shape I recognized, the same way you recognize a garment silhouette from across a room before you can see the details. I went home each night that month and behaved, as much as I could manage, like nothing had changed. I let Marcus believe the destroyed dresses were the worst of what he'd need to answer for. I smiled at dinner. I asked him about his day. And every night, once he was asleep, I kept building a file that was growing heavier than any wedding gown I had active own. The lawyer's assistant found something during a routine record search that neither of us expected. Marcus's name showed up in a small civil filing from 6 years earlier, before I'd met him, in a different state. A lawsuit from a former business partner alleging he'd misused funds from a joint venture and disappeared from the partnership before it could be formally dissolved. The case had been settled quietly, out of court, with a confidentiality clause that had kept it from ever surfacing in casual conversation, or in the version of his past he'd told me over the years. I sat with that for a long time. It reframed everything. This wasn't a man who had slipped into bad decisions under pressure during our marriage. This was a pattern that predated me entirely. Someone who had done this before, learned from getting caught the first time, and simply gotten better at hiding it the sacred time around. Then Renata found something even harder to sit with. Going back through the shredded gowns, trying to salvage what beadwork we could for insurance photos, she noticed something about the timing of the destruction. It hadn't happened the morning I found it. The studio's security camera, one Marcus had insisted we install for the neighborhood, had a gap in its footage, exactly matching a window 3 nights earlier. A night he'd told me he was working late. He hadn't destroyed my collection in a moment of impulsive anger, the way I'd assumed. He had planned it, today in advance, timed precisely to the morning that would cost me the most. The one meeting that could have made my business independently successful enough that I wouldn't need him managing my books, my clients, or my money anymore. He hadn't just been stealing from my dream. He had been trying to make sure it never grew big enough to expose him. I thinking confront him with tears. I confronted him with a folder, the same way I admire I'd have approached a difficult alteration, carefully, with a plan for every seize. I asked him to sit down on a Sunday afternoon, told him I wanted to talk about moving forward after the dresses, and coached him settle into the conversation comfortable, assuming I was finally ready to let it go the way I usually let things go. I laid out 4 things, one at a time. The 2 loan documents with my forged signature, the bank statements showing the transfers to his separate account, a printed summary from the lawyer describing the 6-year-old lawsuit and its settlement, and finally, a still image printed from the studio's camera system, time-stamped 3 nights before the flood, showing his car parked outside at 2 a.m. He tried denial first. The signatures were basically the same as authorizing me to handle things. The old lawsuit was ancient history that had nothing to do with us. The camera gap was probably a glitch. Each explanation contradicted the one before it a little more than the last, the way fabric frays faster once the first thread is already pulled loose. I didn't need to raise my voice. I told him, calmly, that I'd already met with an attorney, that the bank's fraud department had opened its own investigation independent of anything I chose to do next, and that Renata and I had already begun the paperwork to formally separate the business's finances from our shared accounts.
I wasn't asking his permission. I was informing him of what was already moving. Marcus moved out 3 weeks later. The forged loan documents became part of a fraud investigation that, as far as I know, is still working its way through the process the lawyer warned me could take time. The business survived. Barely financially, but it survived. And Renata and I rebuilt a smaller version of the collection together over the following 2 months, working nights the way we had when we first started out. Except this time, nobody was waiting up at home resenting the hours. I called the Chicago buyer myself, months later than planned, and told her honestly what had happened, without the polish of a rehearsed pitch. She placed a smaller initial order than the one I'd originally hoped for, but it was real, and it was mine, made without anyone's fingerprints on it but my own and Renata's. The studio itself changed too, in small ways that mattered more than I expected. My grandfather's old sewing machine, the one I'd kept boxed up in storage because Marcus said it cluttered the space, came out and sat on the work table again. Not because I use it much anymore, but because it reminded me why I started. I stopped answering client calls with a slight flinch, waiting to see if I'd need to explain the conversation to someone later. My mother came to the studio the week after Marcus moved out, something she hadn't done in over a year, and sat quietly in the corner while I worked, the way she used to when I was a teenager sewing at her kitchen table. She didn't ask many questions. She just said, at one point, that she'd wondered for a while why our visits had gotten so short, and that she was glad I was home more now, in whatever way home meant at that point. Not everything closed the way I might have wanted. I don't know whether the earlier lawsuit's plaintiff ever learns what happened here, and some nights I wonder if I owe that stranger a phone call. Then remind myself it isn't my history to carry forward. Marcus and I speak only through lawyers now. I don't wish him ruin. I wish him far away from anything I still care about. What I gained wasn't the satisfaction of watching him unravel, though I won't pretend that didn't matter to me the day it happened. What I gained was understanding, finally, the difference between a partner who helps carry your dream and one who's quietly renting space inside it. I still sew every day. I still believe in what a wedding gown means to the person wearing it. I just don't hand anyone the scissors anymore without asking first what they plan to do with them. I think about how long I called his help handling things, how many spreadsheets and signatures and late-night texts I let pass without questioning, because questioning them felt smaller than the marriage itself. None of it looked like danger while it was happening. It looked like a man being practical about money I was too busy to think about. So I'll leave you with the question that stayed with me since that morning in the studio. How much of your own name are you willing to hand someone else to manage before you stop being able to tell which decisions were ever really yours? And if someone were quietly cutting away at your dream, one small permission at a time, would you notice before there was nothing left to repair?